Faces and chapters from the Central European legal heritage. Welcome to the Central European Legal Insights, the podcast series introducing the professors of the Central European Academy at the University of Miskolc through insightful conversations with Judit Varga.
While our notion of family might be different across these countries, our experiences might be different, but overall the needs of children are the same. So whether it is in Slovakia, whether it is in Mexico or Peru or Japan, a child wants to be loved, protected, and childhood, is not a preparation for a future life. Childhood is life. And when you look at children, and when you observe children, you see that when they are happy, they play. When they are sad, they play. In fact, when you find a child who's not playing, you know that something is really wrong. So I think children learn their role in the stage of life through play. They develop through play. So I think this is a unique project in the region, unique not only in the region, but unique maybe even Europe or worldwide, because it provides a platform for researchers to meet, to discuss, to publish together, to work together, to do research together. The outcome of this research is incredible. The number of books, the number of publications, the number of scientific outputs is immense and incredibly enriching. And the fact that it is open access is a huge benefit, I think.
Welcome to Central European Legal Insights, the podcast series of the Central European Academy at the University of Miskolc. My name is Judit Varga and I work as a senior mentor at the Academy. And in this series of podcasts, we would like to show you the faces and the personalities of the Central European Professors Network. Throughout the conversations, we would like to bring you closer to the rich diversity of Central Europe's legal heritage, but also to explore the stories and the ideas beyond science that connect us in this region. And with this, I warmly welcome Professor Dr. Lilla Garayová from the Pan-European University of Bratislava, Slovakia. Welcome to Budapest. It's my pleasure that you took on with me this adventure to present you as one of the main characters and personalities of the Professors Network. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It's an honor being here.
I just would like to present you, but of course later on you can add any other detail which I would miss from your career, but listeners should know that you are an associate professor of international law and you are the deputy dean at the Pan-European University and you are responsible for international relations. And in your practice and in your research, you focus on international family law. So at the same time, you are a specialist for family law, but also for international law and international relations. So this also means that the comparative law is also one of your specialties. And you are a long-standing partner of the Central European Academy. It's just one of the few books to which you've been contributing in the past. But just to name a few of them, The Protection of the Family in the Legal System from 2021, The Right to Parental Custody from 2022, Demographic Challenges, Legal Responses from 23, and Assisted Reproductive Technologies is also one of your works and writings to our academy. And in addition, you also took part in many conferences. You also had workshops. You are an active participant of these networks. So I would like to start by actually introducing you as a person, as a lawyer coming from this region. And actually the first thing which I would ask about your own motivation, your inspiration, how come that you became a lawyer? And throughout your career, were there any moments when you felt that, yes, this is why I wanted to be a lawyer?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think, looking back, even as a child, I was very much drawn to knowledge and to sharing it. So, when I was a child, I was forcing my friends and my sister to sit as students in my classes, that I pretended to give them. So looking back, I think it was quite a natural evolution of things that I became a lawyer and that I became active in academia. And law itself, I think, I was very much drawn to, first of all, because I was presented with a choice when I was 18 years years old, and that was a choice from my mother, who told me either become a doctor or a lawyer, and from the two, law felt like the better choice at the time. And I think it was a great choice for me, because law, I view it as a language that kind of organizes our common lives, our day-to-day lives. It is something that gives an answer to who is protected, how the protection works, who has to be heard. So to me, it has a deeply, deeply personal meaning.
And were there any, detail about your own personal motivation to defend someone and to stand up for the rights of some parts of the society or groups of the society already at an early stage in your career, or it just came by accident that you became a specialist for children's rights and also actually a warrior for children's rights?
Well, so children's rights is not something that I originally started with. So I did my PhD after I completed my master's studies. I did it from criminal law, and that was purely because the supervisor that I have chosen for myself was active in criminal law, not because I was attracted to criminal law that much. I knew who I wanted to be my supervisor, and I went after him.
Yes, I heard this in your motivational speech this morning at the conference. It was very, very good contribution, and I think it's a very good inspiration also for those young researchers who maybe didn't find or haven't found the topic yet, and then it can evolve later on.
Exactly, and that's what happened to me. It took me a while to figure out what exactly was my niche, and I think that's okay. Exploration is part of the journey. Not everybody knows when they are doing their PhD what their future focus is really going to be. For me, it came after I completed my PhD, and it was during actually one of the CA projects when it kind of solidified in me that is the path that I wanted to take. So
great. And how would you explain to those who are not lawyers? What do you do in your research, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so I devote my time to children's rights primarily, and also international family law. At the university, I teach both international law and family law, and I try to combine the two. And we are also starting a course on children's rights, which is the first in Slovakia of its kind. And for me, protecting children and children's lives, I think, is very important to mention that it is more than just international treaties or conventions or words in a paper. It is about every child. It is about the child that you and I were once. It is about your nephew, your niece, the child down the street who wants to be loved, protected, and feel secure. And I think we owe it to them to provide a world where their rights are protected. And it took us as a community, as a legal community, a while, the 20th century, until we had some sort of protection on paper of children's rights. And I think it still is under evolution every single day. So I think that is the true meaning of protecting children's rights, giving a voice to someone who historically has not had a voice.
And do you take also individual cases, or you rather search on the framework, on the legal framework, which gives the guarantees? On
occasion, I do work on individual cases as well. However, most of my time I devote to research and academia. So that is my main focus. So rather the larger framework of things, and trying to improve things through that research, through my work that I do, and I hope that it contributes to the future of children's rights.
In your beautiful track record, actually, as a specialist in international family law, you came across the legal practice of many other countries. You participated in many international conferences. How did this experience shape your vision about the Slovakian family law?
So, traveling and visiting other countries, I think, is one of the greatest privileges of my career. I truly enjoy it. I love visiting other countries and discovering their legal systems, their protection, how they work with children and children's rights. And I think, every country that I have visited, every university where I lectured gave me something. I learned something from every single community. In Mexico, I saw incredible resilience of communities and how they raise children. When I was in Japan, I saw how cultural traditions influence how they raise their children. Or when I was on Trinidad and Tobago, I saw how, for example, their justice system works and how young, for example, criminal responsibilities for children. So every one of these visits, every single country gave me something and broadened my lens. And every single time I came home to Slovakia, looking at our legal system a little bit more in a different light, a little bit more clearly, because I think all of these visits kind of make you see your own legal system from a different perspective.
From out of the box.
Yeah, exactly. So none of the visits really pulled me away from Slovakia, rather solidified that that's where I want to be active, that's where I want to pursue children's rights and advance children's rights, and also kind of give you an understanding that while our notion of family might be different across these countries, our experiences might be different, but overall the needs of children are the same. So whether it is in Slovakia, whether it is in Mexico or Peru or Japan, a child wants to be loved, protected, and childhood, is not a preparation for a future life. Childhood is life.
Oh. And if you could not be European and you were reborn, what is your favorite country? Where would you like to be a child outside of Europe, based on your experience?
Oh, wow.
It's just, a question, a theoretical question, but it can show how you prefer those legal systems protecting the children outside of Europe.
Yeah, that is a very interesting question.
What would you recommend me to be reborn? Of course, I would like to be Hungarian again, but it's just a theoretical question.
There's, of course, more to life than just child protection or how we view children in community. But, for example, I really loved how in Mexico the families are still multi-generational. They have, generally the grandparents, the great-grandparents living together with the parents and the children. And, that gives you a different sense of belonging, a different sense of community. So maybe it's not just from a legal perspective, but from a societal perspective.
From a cultural background.
Yeah, exactly. I really enjoyed that perspective. And, when I was visiting one of the universities, CETIS University in Mexico, and giving a speech there, the dean asked me, about my family situation, how many sisters, brothers do I have? And I said I had one sister, and he was like, oh no, why? What happened? I was like, well, that's quite normal,
Yes, unfortunately.
So their view of the families is very different, and of children and their role in society is very different. And honestly, I really enjoyed seeing that.
Well, now let's move on to special legal topics. Actually, we collected 3 of those. And since you are a lawyer in Europe and Slovakia is a member of the European Union, we cannot avoid talking about the constitutional identity, which is also at the core elements of the Central European Academy, because our mission is that we would like to show our constitutional identities to the other parts of Europe. So, and since you are only specialized in family law, but you are an all-round lawyer and a researcher, you could also give us a hint about the constitutional identity in Slovakia. But just let's start by describing to those non-lawyers who might listen to us, how should we think about constitutional identity? What is the everyday definition of it?
Yeah. So, when you mention constitutional identity to a layperson who's not a lawyer, I think it sounds very dry and something only a professor could love or a lawyer could love. But realistically, I think constitutional identity or constitution itself is a country's DNA. It is our core values. It is what we want to protect, even when we are part of something bigger like the European Union. It is a manifestation of what we believe in as our core values. So I think when we talk about constitutional identity in Slovakia, the question really is, what makes Slovakia Slovakia? What is important to the nation? What is worthy of constitutional protection? And that is, I think, really important, especially now in the 21st century, and especially as a member state of the European Union.
Yeah, actually, you forecast my second question, because exactly nowadays this definition is more and more popular, because we are members of the European Union, and there is a constant, if not conflict, but sometimes debates between the primacy of EU law and the constitutional identity of the member states, when each and every measure is actually coming from Brussels, and the member states are facing this challenge, how to implement it, how to transpose it to the domestic legal system. And what do you think that the constitutional identity is more about protecting traditions, or finding the way how to live with change, because this is also a certain change?
Yeah. So, we have been a member state of the EU for 20 years. And when we joined, at the time, the discussion was mostly about economics and about the future benefits, potential financial benefits of joining and of switching to euro from the Slovak crown and all of these things. Nowadays, the discussion has much more focused on constitutional identity and our values and our traditions. And I think the question that you ask is a fascinating paradox, because constitutional identity or a protection of constitutional identity can serve both as a shield and a compass. And on the one hand, it is there to protect traditions. So every society needs to preserve certain values that are important. The language, the family, human dignity. Depends on each society, right? What is worthy of constitutional protection. But if we only use constitutional identity as a shield, then of course it becomes very rigid. So I think it needs to be a bit of a flexible concept, or a bit of a something that allows us to work with the time, to understand how we evolve. Without the anchor of constitutional identity, we risk that the values that are worthy of protection are going to be dissolved. So I think a constitution cannot exist without that DNA. We cannot survive without what makes us uniquely Slovak within the European Union.
And can you just tell us about one precedent, which was a typical example how this DNA was challenged because of European legislation or international requirements, or was it a legal dispute in the public in the legal scholars public life to discuss a certain challenge? Because one of my friends, Minister János Bóka, is a very learned colleague, and he always described this situation. The European law and the national law, when they encounter in certain crucial questions, when an unstoppable power meets a stable rock. The stable rock is the constitution, and the unstoppable power is the EU primacy, EU law primacy, which sometimes looks like an unstoppable object coming from Mars.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it's right now, I would say, an ongoing debate in Slovakia as we speak, because we had a very recent constitutional amendment in September of 2025, which discusses exactly national identity, culture, and ethics, and discusses the primacy of the Slovak constitution in these questions ahead of EU law. Now, of course, the reception of this constitutional amendment was not uniform. Not everybody loved, or not everybody loves the wording, but I think that the wording is very interesting, and it is not just about the primacy of EU law. It is a package of amendments or a package of changes that are newly introduced to our constitution. And I think the interesting thing about it is that the language was kept deliberately open or flexible to interpretation. So it says that, Slovak constitution has primacy ahead of EU law in questions of national identity, culture, and ethics, but doesn't really explain them, which means that it is a language that is open textured. So I think it will give a great opportunity for our constitutional court, our courts, to interpret how that should look like in reality. But I think it's a very interesting evolution and a very interesting solidifying of our constitutional identity in the 21st century. And, kind of trying to identify or pin down what it is that is the core values that should be in the constitution.
So actually, based on all what you just said, the Constitutional Court in the future might face a lot of work, because if these definitions are kept vague or loose enough to also stand more interpretation, then I think lawyers and constitutional lawyers in Slovakia might have now here a lot of task to fulfill in the future, to fulfill with content this amendment when each case might come. And you also entered the European Union with Hungary at the same year, 2004, so it's more than 20 years now. So based on Slovakia's more than 20 years of experience, what kind of lessons you learned in this balancing exercise, national law, European law, and what could be a good, example or recommendation, a best practice for other countries? What you would recommend?
I think, one of the great things that the past 20 years has shown us that even though we are a small country, we can still teach big lessons about navigating EU law and navigating the European institutions. For us, the last 20 years in Slovakia have been defining. And, defining how we are sovereign and even though while we are European. So I think, it has shown us that Slovakia views the EU more as a choir, not as a solo, but a choir where you still want to have your own voice heard. So, and I think, our constitutional amendment is an exercise, especially in this.
And can you just list those topics or those areas which were amended in the Constitution?
Yeah, so the first, as I mentioned, was the primacy of the Constitution in certain questions. Then the second question that is very interesting is a question of two genders. Mm-hmm. So Slovakia has introduced or solidified the binary view of gender into our Constitution, which says that there are two genders, a man and a woman. Mm-hmm. Now, the Constitution prior to this 2025 amendment already had a provision, Article 41, on marriage, and it said that marriage is a union of a man and a woman.
It's like in the Hungarian.
Exactly. But now it went further and it says that there are two genders, a man and a woman. It does allow that a change of the gender is possible in certain situations. For example, in cases where at time of the birth, the child was not genetically correctly identified, or it allows for these medical things to happen, but it solidifies a view of how Slovak society views gender. And I think this amendment from other countries might look like extreme or might not be very welcome, but I think
not from Hungary.
It is important to mention that Slovak society is still a very conservative society, and these changes and the legislation, when it comes to so deeply personal matters as family law, that has to come from inside. However, other things that are in the Constitution now were defined in our family law. For example, the matter of adoptions. Mm-hmm. This is another change that was introduced into the Constitution. And the Constitution essentially says that adoption is open for married couples, or a spouse, so adopting your spouse's child from previous marriage that ended with a divorce or with the death of a previous spouse, for example. And adoption by a single person is only allowed in exceptional circumstances and only if it is in the best interest of the child.
So you mean that this kind of priority order is settled at the level of the Constitution in Slovakia?
Again, this is not a new concept. This has existed in our legal system since 2005. However, this is the first time that is in a constitutional level.
Actually, maybe you partly already answered my question, which is here in my mind, that what kind of social situation or political situation implied this very moment to amend the Constitution now with this content?
This is partly, I think, a political question and partly a tension between EU law and national identity. I think, these 20 years have given a chance for the member states that joined together with Slovakia 20 years ago to kind of start to look for other areas to solve within EU law, not just necessarily the economic questions, not just the questions of belonging to a union, but also of that protection of that core DNA of our Constitution. And I think, this was the time that it came up, partly because the political situation allowed for it. I will say that the constitutional amendment passed exactly with 90 votes.
What is the majority required?
It's 3/5. So
3/5.
Yes. So we have 150 members of parliament. You need 90, and there were 90 votes. Exactly. So it was a coalition and two members of the opposition party who also voted for the constitutional amendment. So it passed. It is, a very interesting situation because again the majority was there, the 3/5 majority was there, but of course, the dust has not settled yet. We have not seen the full implementation yet. And as I mentioned, the wording is kind of open textured. So it leaves some room for interpretation by the courts, which I think is a great thing, but also can be a bit dangerous.
A lot of room for potential research areas for legal scholars. And it sounds like a preemptive action, because looking at the trends of the Luxembourg court, for the European Union, and we see how each cases might have an impact on this DNA in many member states. This is why maybe the legislator deemed it necessary to put this into the constitution, like a preemptive action. And maybe I just rephrase my question. Would you recommend this kind of amendment to other Central European countries? Because Hungary has the same level of protection of the national DNA, let's say, with also the protection of the family concept. Do you think it is it's a one-size-fits-all solution, or you just let it for other member states to think in line with their own social circumstances?
I don't think necessarily it's a one-size-fits-all solution. I think it depends on the country, the legal history, the culture, the society, where that society is, what is acceptable to them. I do think it is important for every country to protect certain values, certain traditions, and I think constitutional identity is really about that, finding what is worthy of that constitutional protection. So I don't think I could say every country should have the same definition of marriage, the same definition of family. That is dependent on that society, but all of these changes have to come from within that society, right? So while, as I mentioned, Slovak society is very conservative still, there might be different countries that have a different approach, and I think that is okay, but the important thing is to find that DNA that is yours and find what is worthy of protection.
And be in line with that thought. Now we can also link from the constitutional amendment, constitutional identity area of questions to the children's rights and the family law, which is actually your core area of research. So we could also start from from point zero. How would you explain it to me if I was not a lawyer or I was a child? While does family law and children's rights affect the everyday lives of the European citizens?
I think,
or it's not just a technical legal matter.
No, it's definitely not. Again, as I mentioned, it is about every single child. And when I teach family law, generally the first lesson or the first lecture that I start with my students is I explain it to them in very easy terms how family law is a legal field or a field of study that impacts all of them. Mm-hmm. All of them can relate to it because if you're not a husband or a wife, or if you are not a parent, at least you're a child of someone, right? So all of us can relate to that childhood of being a child. So I think that's a very important thing to mention. And children traditionally have not been seen as rights holders, but more as passive subjects of protection, and that has changed significantly in the 20th century. And I think that is really what child protection is about, giving that voice to children and involving them in decisions that affect their lives.
Maybe it's a provocative question in the beginning, but I have 3 children, for example, and sometimes my son comes home from the school, and instead of looking what he has done or what he omitted to do, sometimes they start to criticize the teacher, and I have the right for that and that. And I often tell to them, please first check whether you fulfilled your obligations and think about rights later. Do you think that the ever-growing attention towards children's rights might just damage this kind of very natural balance, what we feel inside, being conservative parents and mothers, that of course, but the teachers also have rights. Of course, this is just one part of children's rights when we are at school, and it's a much bigger world. But do you see that the law did find this balance, or there are some disproportionalities when it comes to rights and obligations? Because a child might also have some obligations, at least to pay attention to the teacher.
Yeah, exactly. Children have obligations too, and I think part of responsible parenthood is to raise children who know and understand those obligations and not only the rights that come with childhood. So I think that is very important as well. And I think the legal system has come a really far way from where we were 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago. In Slovakia, for example, in our Family Act, we have a provision, not only a simple provision, but one of our guarding pillars is the best interest of the child, modeled after the UNCRC UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, but our Family Act went even further and gave exact guidance what that best interest principle is and how courts should view it, and how every court decision has to go through all of these points and involve these in its decision making. So I think, there is some balance. I think, the intention is there. I don't think there is any professional, whether a legal professional or a childcare professional, who doesn't want the best for children. Whether we can achieve it, that's a different question. I think, when it comes to children, for example, and their voice, very important thing. And we see how our legal provisions and their legal systems have changed and allow children to be asked what they want.
Yeah, let's talk about this legal framework when it comes to individual cases, when the decision affect the everyday life of an individual child. And we all know that there is a legal framework from the European Union, and also there is the international legal framework, and this is transposed into your domestic framework, which all is based on the principle, the best interest of the child. But how it is in reality working? Is it really taken into account, for example, the voice of the child when there's a court decision during the divorce, or when childcare institutions have to make certain tough decisions about the future of the child? So how do you see how it is working in reality? So we can also please just tell about the legal framework as well. Is it the same general thing what we all have, or there are some specialties in your country?
I think traditionally in Slovakia and in many other countries, it is not unique for Slovakia. Children, even in the past, I think 20, 30 years, when we already had provisions about children and their voice and the right to being heard, traditionally that voice was always filtered through parents, through caseworkers, social workers, or other experts, right? So it wasn't necessarily the child whose voice you heard. It was already through a third person, or
transmitter.
Exactly. So there was already a filter behind that child's voice. Today, I think things are changing. Courts are more open in Slovakia to hearing children directly, to account for their opinion and to weigh that opinion and take it seriously. When I talk to judges, a lot of the times I ask them, how would you interpret this provision of the UNCRC, the right to be heard? And they start telling me above the age of 12, I should ask the child. And I'm like, so below the age of 12, you should not ask the child? Well, they might not know what they want, and that's not what the UNCRC says, right? So it says evolving capacities. Every child should be heard, and every child should be given a voice and an opportunity to voice their opinion. In accordance with their ability to express themselves. For some children, that might be a drawing. For some children, that might be a very simple language, but they might already know what they want, and that voice should be heard and should be taken into account. Now, of course, that education currently is missing, so we don't really train judges to...
you mean training of judges or officials dealing with...
Yeah.
And what would be your recommendation to judges, for example, in a Central European country? Because we all face this challenge. There were also changes or amendments made to the procedural law in Hungary with this principle to listen to the voice of the child to the utmost. But how you fulfill this obligation varied from court to court, and it was not the fault of the judges in my position. It was just the very natural reaction to this principle. Okay, but which child is in a mental situation in order to be really heard, so that it really makes sense? Because sometimes children don't want to speak, or they are different, and sometimes a 2-year-old can speak more than a 5-year-old. So we all know children. And is there a standard? Is there some kind of measurement or rule? But you could give us a good hope or just a rope to hold on to.
I don't think there should be, for example, an age cap, because again, every child is different, and every child should have that opportunity to express themselves to a certain extent, regardless of their age. So it's not necessarily, what I hear from some judges who, for whatever reason, think it's the age of 12 or the age of 14 when they should ask a child. And very interestingly, in Slovakia, for example, when you adopt a child, even later in life, so the child is already 10 or 12 years old, you have the right as a parent, as the adopting parent, you have the child to change that name of the child, not the surname, but the first name. Imagine the first name, the very identity that you grow with from very early age. You identify as me, Lilla, right? So for that child, thank you. For that child, to take that away at the age of 10 or 12 because the adopting parent says,
it's like depriving of the identity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And courts don't even ask the child about that in these adoption cases. So for me, that's very extreme because that is a very building block of your identity. So there is so much more room to grow. I think we have seen a lot of evolution in procedural law in Slovakia. We have seen a bit more child-sensitive procedures, but we are so far from being ideal.
So when you should mention one weakness of the system, it can be a good example.
Oh,
and there are no legal, interpretation possibilities to overcome this obstacle in the individual case. Like when the judge feels that it is something which might affect the individual's future and also his mental stability or his or her mental stability, then is there any instrument in the procedural law to ask for some kind of position of the child?
Yeah, there is of course, but
there is
it is not mandatory. It is not a standard practice, and I think that is missing. For example, so certain things should not be afforded as a luxury, but should be treated as a natural right of the child. So
speaking about weaknesses, let's speak about strengths. What is which is among the V4 countries, for example, family law, what would you mention as Slovakia as the best in procedural or material law solutions?
I don't know if I want to say the best, among the V4 countries.
You can be biased.
But I think what is very interesting in Slovakia and what has been a trend and what we have seen throughout our constitution and constitutional amendments, and I'm going to say, our constitution is relatively new, our identity as the Slovak Republic, as the independent Slovak Republic is relatively new. But throughout our amendments, we have seen that family became one of the core building blocks of the constitution. And again, I think this is because of what I mentioned, that DNA, right? For Slovakia, family has been a very important part of our DNA and that family protection. So the protection of family, the protection of marriage, the protection of children, the best interest of the child, all of these things are not only in our Family Act, but also in our constitution. So we devote several articles to child protection, to the solidarity between spouses, and things that are also in our Family Act, but elevated to a constitutional level. So the family protection from a constitutional perspective is really strong in Slovakia.
In your motivational speech this morning, actually you also mentioned that there were individual cases, moving situations throughout your career, and you really remember and had an effect on your future work. What would you tell us about this? Were there any eye-opening case or story in your career?
Oh my God, there were a lot. There were so many. One of the things that really has shaped me was my habilitation. I did my habilitation on the right to play. The child's right to play. Yes, exactly.
Don't tell it to my children.
So one of the most forgotten rights of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's Article 31. It's so forgotten that even the Committee on the Rights of the Child often forgets about it or doesn't interact very much with this right, even though it exists. And for me, the interesting thing was that as part of my research, I also had the opportunity to interview children. So I did over 1,000 interviews, and from those children from different countries, different ages, over 94% of them, when I asked the question, they didn't know what the research was about, but they were given a simple question: when are you the happiest?
When are you the happiest?
Yeah, exactly. And over 94% of them said, when I play, or some sort of play. So play was part of the answer, regardless of the age, regardless of the social background, the country of origin of the child. So I think that's really a testament to how universal childhood is, the experience of childhood, and how important play is for children. And we kind of treat it as a luxury right, something that comes after all of the other rights have been fulfilled. The right to education, the right to development, the right to survival, life, and so on and so on. And when you look at children, and when you observe children, you see that, when they are happy, they play. When they are sad, they play. In fact, when you find a child who's not playing, you know that something is really wrong. So I think children learn their role in the stage of life through play. They develop through play. And play is an incredibly important thing for them, and for us and for our governments to treat it as kind of a luxury, kind of a forgotten right, that is, I think, a huge miss.
And did you make a proposal for the government from your thesis to include in the national legislation the right to play? Or are there countries when there is actually an implication of this? Because it sounds like a declarative, right?
There are certain countries where they already have some play policies. Very interestingly, when I also worked with certain countries and governments, and I asked them for statistics. Very simple statistics, for example, about the number of playgrounds. How many of them are urban or rural?
That's a good point from the objective point of view. We guaranteed right.
But even that statistic wasn't easy to get. Most countries don't even have a statistic on that, right? And most countries view, even when they interact with the right to play, they view it as playground. But it is much more than that. It is time to play. It is playmate. It is having children to play with. It is having that freedom to play. So I think it is so much more. And for me, what was really astounding was the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. When I looked at their concluding observations, their recommendations to states, they break it down by articles of the UNCRC. And when they come to Article 31, they generally forget about it. So it's not even included in most of the concluding observations, or when it is included, it is very superficial. And I have raised this to some members of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and they were very surprised, and they were like, oh, you're right. Nobody really writes about it. Nobody really talks about it. So we don't know how to approach it that much. And I'm not going to quote the member of the UNCRC who said that, but it was very interesting for me to hear. And then I have been, watching the development in 2025, the first half of the year, and I see that the right to play is mentioned in a lot more concluding observations than it has been historically. But the recommendations are very superficial. So there were concluding observations that came out in 2025 for Norway, for Slovakia, for Peru, for the different countries, and the recommendation is pretty much the same, almost the exact wording, even though the challenges that children face are very, very different in these countries.
And just to be clear, with the present legal situation after the change of the constitution, how does the Slovak constitution define family? Or it's rather in parts, like you just said at the beginning. Yeah,
so the constitution itself doesn't define family. It leaves it kind of open to interpretation. It does say that marriage is a union of a man and a woman.
Marriage?
It does define marriage, right? Our legislation, our Family Act, also says that a family based on marriage is the basic building block of society. It does acknowledge that there are other forms of families as well, but still it gives a kind of precedence or it gives a preference to marriage-based families or families created by marriage, but it does acknowledge that not all families are the same, and not all family experiences are the same. So we do have this kind of a distinction in our legislation, not necessarily a precise definition of family. And I think it's very interesting when I start teaching family law, the first lecture, I ask students, what is a family? How we define it? And some of them start saying it's mother, father, and child. Some of them will say, but my mom is divorced. Are we not a family? And I think it's a mother and a child. And I ask them, like, what about a married couple, a childless married couple? Is it not a family? Well, and some students will say, no, it's not a family. Some students will say, yes, it is a family. Some students, and I ask them, what about a married couple who has a child and then that child tragically passes, right? Is it no longer a family just because the child is no longer with them? So these are very sensitive questions, very difficult questions to answer. And I think our legal systems, and not only our Slovak legal system, but also international law, doesn't really define what family is, because there are so many experiences of that family life. We do know that it is worthy of protection. We do know what the ideal is, right? But we don't necessarily confine it within just one single definition.
So based on this, what do you see, what is the biggest challenge for family law in the coming decades? Since you are a very young researcher, so you still have a lot of decades ahead for work, and you are also in touch with the younger generations. So based on all this, how do you see the biggest challenge?
And this is my conviction. You might not agree with it, or there are others who might not agree with it. But I think, society is changing. We are in the 21st century. Of course, there are different forms of family. We have to accept that. However, I think, just because scientific evolution allows us to do certain things are amazing. Having the opportunity to have children to parents who did not have that opportunity before is amazing, especially in an age of such a high infertility rate, right? That is amazing. The other thing that I, however, want to mention it is just because we can doesn't mean we should. So whenever we introduce a new scientific technology, I think the child has to be in the center of that legislation. Is that child who is going to come from a single parent family because I, as a woman, I'm going to choose to have an IVF child deliberately without a father, is that child going to be conceived with their best interest? Or not, right? So I think when we choose the child as the guiding star of our legislation, I think we can't go wrong because, scientific evolution is incredibly rapid and there are so many things we can achieve that we couldn't 10, 20, 30 years ago. But just because we can doesn't mean we should. So that's where I think law and ethics has to...
like bioethics.
Yeah.
I think bioethics has more and more importance nowadays. And you mentioned the infertility rates, and this links us to our topic to discuss the demographic challenges. And you are aware of the fact that the Hungarian presidency, which was last year, actually one of the key priorities was a European demographic challenge. And you also contributed to one of our most beautiful and thickest book, which is here. And thank you again for participating in the composition of this book. And you see the subtitle. I also show it to our listener that this is on the occasion of the Hungarian presidency of the Council. So this is history, and this was also presented in the Council. So we are very proud of it as colleagues of the Central European Academy. But it tackles the very important topic of today. And how do you look at this challenge in general from a Central European perspective? Is your challenge different from other parts of the European challenge?
I don't think necessarily the challenge itself is different. So it's not the demography that's different. I think it is the way that we approach it. So, Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe are facing the same challenges. We have a declining birth rate, we have an aging population, right? But the priorities or the solutions that we offer to it are very different. I think the difference is that Western Europe mostly looks at demography and the demographic issues and their solutions through an individual lens, through migration as a solution for the demographic decline. While in our region, we look at it very differently. First of all, we also have a challenge of brain drain and immigration, a lot of students leaving, a lot of professionals leaving in hopes of a better life or a better salary, right? So our countries, I think, have to grapple with that as well. There is also that cultural difference, right? So Western European debates are very often framed around individual lifestyle choices and around labor market needs, right?
Yeah, like statistical data.
Exactly. Whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, I think it is more about the questions of identity, of tradition, of national survival. How do we make sure that, young couples continue to get married, continue to have children. So family policy, as it is viewed in Central and Eastern Europe, it is more than just policy. I think it is more about culture, and it is also about politics, about geopolitics, right? So while the numbers might look similar, the challenges might look similar, our approaches to them are very different from Western Europe. And I think that's incredibly interesting to see.
I like this distinction, and I fully approve it based on my past experience. And within Central Europe, what is the special Slovakian approach? to help to improve the situation?
You know, in Slovakia, we have a lot of policies that were introduced, similar to Hungary, on kind of motivating families. So one of the key pillars of Slovak family policy is, you know, how do we get young couples to get married? How do we get them to have children? And we have seen that in our policies. We have seen, for example, some tax breaks. We have seen, an opportunity in this demographic challenge. I think there are still some unresolved things. For example, the workplace, right? So women who would like to work part-time. Slovakia is one of the countries where it is the lowest rate of part-time work for women. So
but
that is...
This is the fact, sorry to disturb, but the fact is the lowest, or the legal framework for that is
the fact. The fact.
So the possibility legally exists, but they don't make use of it.
It exists. Or the employers don't offer it enough, right? So there are still some gaps that could be better, of course. But I think, and also, for example, accessible and affordable childcare. I would love to see that implemented much stronger. But in general, I think Slovakia has made a lot of strides, a lot of advancements in family policy. Maybe not as strong yet as Hungary. I think Hungary has been really the leader in the Central European region, and we have taken, I think, a lot of inspiration from that as well. But again, there are still some gaps. So it is really great. This book here as well is really great because we can learn so much from each other's experiences. And I want to mention that all of these publications are open access. So it's incredibly important because it affords us something that we didn't have before. A lot of our policies, a lot of our laws are not translated to English or to a lingua franca that all of us would understand. But these publications are in English, and they gather experts from the Central European region who all introduce their own systems, their own legislation, their own policies in English. So you have kind of a collection of best practices from this region, and that's incredibly powerful.
And do you think it raises attention overseas as well?
I know it does, because I was actually asked by an American publisher, an American research group and publisher, to contribute to a book on demographic winter that they are preparing. And they asked me because they have read this book, and so they asked me to contribute with the Central European chapter. It was very interesting because they mentioned that originally they didn't even think about this region, but then someone mentioned it to them that there are some advancements, there are some very innovative approaches compared to the US, compared to the Western European policies in Central and Eastern Europe. And then when they were researching, they found this publication, and so they reached out to me and asked to contribute.
So you are going to work on it in the future. Actually, this is a great feedback and encouragement for our colleagues who are working hard on those series, so that not only the cover and the shape of this book, which is beautiful, but they also are encouraged to work harder to give more publicity to our open access publications and books, because actually this is the very objective of Central European Academy, to be visible, and not only Hungarians but everyone in this region, and to show our commonalities and also our differences. And here this collection is a beautiful example for that. So you are actually published then also overseas. I think it's not your first book overseas, based on your very, very strong track record, international track record. But coming back to the comparative law on family support schemes, it's not only legal field, it's also policy field, and also economic decisions are included. What do you like the most, for example, from the Hungarian system? I assume you are aware of the details of the Hungarian child support scheme, which is actually based on the very principle of the respect of the labor. But if you are also a family man or family woman, through the respect of family, respect of work, actually society rewards working mothers and fathers. And this is how we touched upon these issues through the taxation regulation. And for example, as of 1st of October 2025, Hungarian mothers who have at least 3 children, they never ever will pay a personal tax on the labor. I think it's a huge acknowledgement also, all the job which is done, unnoticed
exactly
by families.
Often they say that the work, especially of a woman, but not just a woman, but the work that you devote to your family is invisible labor, right? Nobody really notices it. Nobody appreciates it. You don't get a promotion for it.
There's criticism.
Exactly.
Mama, my shirt is not good.
And it is
no sandwich.
And it is 24/7. So if you were offered a job by an employer and they told you, it's going to be 24/7, no opportunity for promotion, no pay, no salary, no breaks. Right? Would you take it? Well, probably not, right? Because it sounds extreme, but that is what women do. That is what mothers do. That is what fathers do as well, right? So I think, having that acknowledgement that work in a family is also work, raising a family is hard work and deserves some recognition. I think that is huge. So I have, seen the Hungarian development. I have read a lot about the recent developments as well. So I'm going to be very curious to see the implementation, how it's going to work, and hopefully take it as an inspiration to our Slovak policy framework as well.
Yeah, so this is my question actually. What would you recommend from those measures if you could now make some proposals for a legislative body to implement?
I think
the first priority.
First priority, I think, would be to reach to this publication and see the best practices from around the region. I would definitely recommend that.
So you need a committee, a special committee on that.
Exactly. Exactly.
To analyze.
And then for me, personally, based on my work with family law, with a lot of families, I think accessible and affordable childcare. It is a huge problem right now in Slovakia. There are not enough kindergartens. There are not enough, childcare opportunities. And if we have a child, if we have a young couple, often that weighs in the decision. Will we be able to support this family on one salary for several years to come? Mm-hmm. So I think that would be a huge step forward, making sure that families who decide to have children are safe in the knowledge that childcare is going to be affordable and accessible. Mm-hmm. So right now it is a pretty...
So to foster the establishment of more childcare centers, kindergartens.
Yeah, exactly, or more opportunities, for women to return to the workforce if it is part-time, to make sure that they can stay with their children as long as possible. Right now our Central European countries, I think, are still leading the world in these opportunities of maternity leave or paternity leave or parental leave, right? Which is incredibly interesting. When I mention it to colleagues abroad, they are always shocked, right? Yes. So that is a huge thing, but also making sure that after the third year, that family can still thrive because there's going to be childcare that's accessible, that's affordable. That is a huge thing. So I think there I would love to see some policies change and some opportunities, which I know is going to take not just policy change but also money and a lot of work from the government as well. But I think that's where I would love to see a development.
So, Professor Garayová, I thank you for this very, very lively discussion. The final session would be about your story with our Central European Academy, because also the goal with this podcast is to show us what we do, how we encounter beautiful professors like you, having this valuable career, and you also enrich our network. And how did you come across the Central European Academy? When was it? How did it happen?
I think it was in the very beginning of the Central European Academy. When the Central European Academy started, I myself was, I'm not even sure if I should say young researcher. I wasn't that young anymore. I was already behind, I already had the PhD completed. I already had several publications under my belt. I was teaching as an assistant professor at the time. And at the time, my research focus has not been fully solidified yet. I was kind of trying a lot of new things, a lot of interesting things. I started to turn my focus towards family law, which I started to teach at the university as well. well. And it was at the time when I was asked to participate in a project, in a professors network project. And, I have to mention this project as kind of a turning point in my life, in my professional career. I really credit the Central European Academy with this, because it was a project on family law, on the protection of families in Central and Eastern Europe. And I was asked to contribute.
21.
Yes, for Slovakia. And, all of the other professors from the region, I think were a lot more established, a lot more experienced than me, but they have welcomed me. And throughout the years, we have become, I think, they've become not just my colleagues, my mentors, but also lifelong friends. And I credit so much of my professional development to them, to that team, to that research group, to that research, and the years that came after that. I'm still in touch with every single professor from that group. We still exchange academic ideas. We collaborate a lot still to this day. So to me, that really was a turning point, because it was during that project when I was, absolutely sure that this is my niche, this is what I want to devote my time to, family law, and more specifically children within the family and children's rights.
And do you see similar initiatives in this region, which are not only similar but maybe identical to all what we are trying to achieve? Exactly what you just mentioned, that there is a network, there is not only network, making friends among Central European legal scholars, because it is not about books, it's about people.
Yeah, I'm going to say, the network that you are able to build during this project and during these projects is absolutely incredible and amazing, and we still work together. But that wouldn't have been possible without that initial project of the Central European Academy. So I think this is a unique project in the region, unique not only in the region, but unique maybe even Europe or worldwide, because it provides a platform for researchers to meet, to discuss, to publish together, to work together, to do research together. The outcome of this research is incredible. The number of books, the number of publications, the number of scientific outputs is immense and incredibly enriching. And the fact that it is open access is a huge benefit, I think. And truly the scale of contribution and the opportunities that we were given is incredible. For me, I think, again, as I mentioned, it was a turning point in my life, so I'm very grateful for that. And also, publications is one thing, but the people that I've met, the people that have formed me to the researcher, to the professor that I am today, that's invaluable. So I think that's a huge thing.
It's fantastic. I'm so happy to hear this. And when we started the project, it was focused on the literally Central European countries, and mostly the EU member states. But we started with 5, 6, 7, 8 countries cooperating. Of course, not countries, but faces and personalities and professors from those countries and the junior researchers. But today we actually grew into a 16-country network. And it's quite a huge challenge to provide an equal treatment for all of our partners. And this is why we choose every event, every conference as an opportunity to provide display for certain countries. And this year we organized, actually it's happening now, the 4th annual scientific conference of the Central European Academy. And for the first time there are nations also who are having the main role, and Slovakia was among those first 4 nations who could have their own thematic, half-day and seminars, programs. And also last year, it was also my pleasure to participate at the Children's Rights Conference, Children's Rights Days, last December, if I'm not mistaken. And Slovakia was the special guest country. Also your minister, Deputy Prime Minister, was also one of the key speakers. So how does this affect not only you personally, but also the scientific life in Slovakia? Because this shows a big international focus.
I think it is an incredible opportunity, because when I look at different research projects, different research networks, in general, larger countries have the strongest voice, right? And, who is really interested in a small Central European country of a mere 5 million people, right? So a lot of the times our voice kind of gets marginalized, is in the background. And here in the Central European Academy, all of these events, the ASCEA conference, which is the conference Conference of Young Researchers and the Children's Rights Day really showed us that we have a place at the table. So we can introduce our contributions, we have a voice, and we have that scientific credit and that momentum. And that was incredible to be able to showcase that. Last year in the Children's Rights Day, we had children here from Slovakia. It was devoted to mental health and children, and we had the Ombudsman for Children's Rights and children from Slovakia speaking about their experiences of their childhood in Slovakia. I think that's incredible. Having that opportunity as a small Central European country that, some might say, who would be interested in that? Having that opportunity to sit at the table and to talk about our experiences, our legal frameworks, that's incredible.
The very mission of, among many valuable missions of the Central European Academy was one that we have to know each other better. Because in order to have a reasonable diplomatic discussion between the member states of the European Union, we have to know each other. We have to know the history, the background, the cultural background. And we try to raise also awareness about our special cultural details or national identity, constitutional identity issues. So if I were someone from the other part of the world and I had no knowledge about Central Europe, not even about Europe, what do you think would be the 5 most important information what I had to take away as a message about your country?
Oh, about my country.
It can be anything. But what you feel it is important to know?
Well, I think a few things, we already have mentioned during the podcast, a few things that I think can resonate with someone who has never been to this region, has never visited Slovakia, is our relatively young constitutional history, for example. Like the constitution is younger than many of the law professors that you will probably meet. It's from 1993. So it is a relatively new constitution. But during that constitutional development, we have achieved so many things. We became a member state of the EU, the NATO. We have had many judges in international courts. We've had a huge mark in scientific evolution, in legal science as well. I think it is very interesting to also mention our commitment to family. As I mentioned, it is a core part of our constitution, family protection. So family is really a cornerstone of Slovak identity and of our constitutional DNA, if you will. So I think that is also very interesting to mention. Now, when it comes to Slovakia, I think an interesting and important thing to mention is also that we are very small, a country of 5 million people. But I think
there are smaller in the EU.
Yes, exactly. But I think, our place in the European Union, our place in legal debates is there at the table. So in spite of our small size, I think the contribution has been immense to legal scholarship. I also want to mention that we are, in the heart of Europe. I know Hungary also likes to say that we are the heart of Europe. I think, this region is the heart of Europe. But, if you read any book about Slovakia, one of the things that it is always mentioned that it is really Central Europe. And I think it really is not just geographically, but also symbolically or figuratively, this kind of a bridge between the East and the West. And it has always been so, between tradition and modernity, between, EU integration and constitutional identity. I think we are there, we are that bridge between East and the West. So I think that's very important. And then finally, I think, outside of law, outside of, constitution, I think, we have the best castles, mountains, and dumplings. So that's probably, that's probably, how you discover what being Slovak is like, going a hike to the Tatra Mountains, have Brinzové halušky, and, take a look at one of our castles. So I think, that's how you can really experience
Thank you
Slovakia.
very much, Lilla. Actually, the final question is about... it's not a question. I give you the opportunity to send messages for young researchers. Why would you recommend them to get in touch with the academy? Why would you tell even Western European researchers to come to Central Europe and to discover our beauty and potential for the research?
Well, I think, the Central European Academy has become my second academic home. I think it builds not only collaboration, not only books, but it builds people, it builds careers. It has been instrumental in my own path. So I think it is an incredibly special place for collaboration. I think many academic networks kind of give you scale, dozens of countries, hundreds of researchers. You see that during different academic networks, not just the Central European Academy, but it is very easy to feel lost in that crowd. In the Central European Academy, regardless of the size of the country that you come from, you have a voice. You can have that voice. You can, publish a book. You can be part of an incredibly important research, and you can make your voice be heard. So I think that's incredibly important. I think having a research network that focuses on that Central European voice is unique and incredibly important. And to be able to share that knowledge and not work in silos by seniority, by country, by discipline, that's I think is incredible, and that's what makes Central European Academy very, very unique. So it gives you an opportunity to take your ideas that you have learned at home, take your legislation that you are familiar with to that international stage, and to present it and to learn from others who have presented theirs.
Thank you, Professor. Actually, can we have the copyright of this advertisement for the Central European Academy? Because after listening to your statements, I would love to come if I were a young researcher now. Thank you very much again for being with us. And dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to this lively discussion with Professor Dr. Lilla Garayová from the Pan-European University from Bratislava, Slovakia. Please stay with us for the next podcast as well. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Central European Legal Insights. Don't forget to follow us on our social media channels for updates. To discover more conversations from the series, be sure to explore our other episodes. Thank you for listening.